What if I told you Africa just changed the global map? Not with war, not with sanctions, but with geography. A new maritime corridor is emerging. A new economic lifeline is forming. A shift that could challenge decades of Western dominance over global trade routes. For more than 500 years, global commerce has flowed through corridors largely influenced by Western powers, from the Atlantic shipping lanes that fueled empires to the Suez Canal connecting Europe and Asia, to strategic Mediterranean choke points guarded by powerful naval fleets. Control over sea routes has long meant control over markets, energy supplies, and political influence. But now, something is changing. Across Africa's vast coastline, new ports are expanding. Rail lines are connecting landlocked regions to the sea. And regional trade agreements are strengthening intra-African commerce. Instead of depending solely on traditional routes shaped by Europe and North America, African nations are developing alternatives and negotiating partnerships on new terms. This isn't just about infrastructure. It's about leverage. When trade routes shift, power shifts. When supply chains reroute, influence follows. So the real question is no longer whether Africa matters in global trade. The question is, are we witnessing the start of a new era in global commerce? Now let's be clear, Africa did not literally discover a new ocean, but strategically, economically, politically. It might feel that way. For decades, many African exports relied on trade routes influenced or secured by Western military alliances and infrastructure systems, control over key global choke points, like the Suez Canal, the Gibraltar Strait, Mediterranean naval zones, and major Atlantic trade corridors, shaped how goods move to global markets. The structure often left African economies operating within frameworks they did not fully control. But now, the landscape is shifting. We're seeing expansion of Red Sea infrastructure, rapid development of East African ports, Sahel nations rethinking logistics partnerships, and a rise in South-South trade corridors connecting Africa more directly with Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. This shift isn't just about ports or shipping lanes. It's about maritime sovereignty. It's about who controls the gateways. And when gateways change hands, the balance of power changes with them. Across Africa, massive port investments are reshaping the continent's role in global trade. On the East African coast, expansion are increasing container capacity and modernizing terminals to handle larger vessels. Along the Red Sea, maritime upgrades are improving efficiency, security, and direct access to Asian markets. On the Atlantic side, new logistics hubs are emerging to strengthen exports to the Americas and Europe. Meanwhile, Indian Ocean connectivity corridors are linking inland regions to global sea lanes through rail and highway networks. This is not random development, it's strategic positioning. African countries are strengthening direct shipping ties with Asia, the Middle East, emerging economies, and regional African trade blocs. Instead of routing goods primarily through traditional colonial era networks centered on Europe, governments are diversifying partnerships and negotiating routes that reduce over-reliance on any single power. The goal is resilience. Where supply chains are diversified, economies become less vulnerable to political pressure, sanctions, or maritime disruptions. When ports are domestically controlled and regionally integrated, governments gain negotiating leverage. This doesn't mean Western influence disappears overnight, but it does mean influence becomes shared. And in global trade, shared influence shifts the balance of power. Because in the end, whoever controls the ports doesn't just move goods, they shape the future of commerce itself. Trade dominance is not built on speeches or summits. It's built on infrastructure. Real power in global commerce comes from ports that can handle megaships, railways that move goods inland efficiently, energy corridors that power industry, modern customs systems that reduce delays, and regional trade agreements that remove barriers. Across Africa, these foundations are being strengthened. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, is accelerating intra-African commerce by lowering tariffs and encouraging cross-border investment. Instead of economies operating in isolation, exporting raw materials outward and importing finished products back at higher prices, there is a growing push to process resources locally, trade regionally, and export strategically. That means building refineries instead of shipping crude, manufacturing components instead of exporting minerals unprocessed, creating regional supply chains that connect West Africa to East Africa, north to south. When goods produced in West Africa move directly to East African markets without first routing through European hubs, that represents more than convenience. It's a structural shift. It reduces dependency on legacy trade patterns shaped by colonial history. It strengthens internal markets. It increases negotiating leverage with global partners. This is why infrastructure matters more than rhetoric. Because when supply chains change direction, economic gravity shifts. And that shift, that reorientation of trade flows, is what creates the new ocean effect, redefining Africa's role in global commerce. Global trade depends on stability and predictability. Shipping companies, energy markets, and manufacturing supply chains all rely on secure sea lanes and reliable transit routes. For centuries, Western naval dominance helped guarantee that security. Major fleets patrol key choke points, protected cargo vessels, and maintained open maritime corridors that supported a largely Western-led economic order. But the landscape is evolving. Multipolar naval presence is increasing across strategic waters. Asian investment in African ports and logistics infrastructure continues to rise. Middle Eastern partnerships are expanding to financing, energy cooperation, and maritime development. At the same time, African-led maritime security initiatives are growing stronger, with regional coordination focused on protecting coastlines and trade routes. The result is not chaos, it's diversification. When multiple powers invest, patrol, and trade across the same corridors, influence becomes distributed rather than concentrated. That creates more negotiation power for African nations, more leverage in trade agreements, and more autonomy in choosing economic partners. The real question isn't whether Western influence suddenly disappears. The real question is whether the global system shifts from a single dominant maritime power to a landscape where Western nations become one of several major players competing, cooperating, and negotiating in a truly multipolar trade environment. From a Western strategic lens, the shift naturally brings concern. Why? Because trade routes are not just about commerce, they are about leverage. For decades, control or strong influence over maritime choke points has allowed Western powers to shape global outcomes. Strategic sea lanes made it possible to enforce sanctions, regulate supply chains, project military power, and apply diplomatic pressure when necessary. Access to ports and control over shipping assurance finance systems and naval patrol zones amplified that influence. When a nation or alliance can influence how goods move, it also influences how economies function. If African countries diversify partnerships, expand independent port infrastructure, and build alternative corridors that reduce reliance on traditional Western control networks, the balance of leverage shifts. Enforcement tools become less automatic. Economic pressure becomes more complicated. Influence must be negotiated rather than assumed. This does not signal collapse. It signals recalibration. A multipolar trade environment requires no diplomacy, no security arrangements, and no economic partnerships. Western nations may remain power players, but they may no longer operate from a position of uncontested dominance. And when dominance transitions into competition, alliances evolve. Because in global geopolitics, shifts in trade routes rarely stay limited to trade alone. The Sahel region is undergoing rapid political transformation. Several governments are redefining external partnerships, reassessing security cooperation models, and seeking greater control over national resources and strategic infrastructure. These shifts are not happening in isolation. They are directly connected to trade, logistics, and geopolitical alignment. At the same time, the Red Sea corridor is emerging as one of the most strategically valuable waterways in the world. It connects Europe, Asia, and Africa, serving as a critical artery for energy shipments and global commerce. Control over ports, rail links, and adjacent infrastructure along this corridor translates into significant geopolitical influence. If African states coordinate effectively, aligning port developments, security strategy, and regional trade policies, they gain bargaining power in global negotiations. Instead of reacting to external pressure, they can negotiate from a position of strength. And in a multipolar world, coordinated leverage becomes a powerful tool. What happens if Africa significantly increases internal trade? Manufacturing expands as regional demand grows. Local industries scale up instead of exporting raw materials only. Regional currencies strengthen with higher cross-border transactions. Job creation rises across logistics, processing, technology, and services. And supply chains become shorter and more efficient when goods move within the continent rather than traveling thousands of miles overseas for processing and re-import. Cost decrease and value stays closer to home. This transformation reduces vulnerability to external shocks. Whether global recessions, geopolitical tensions, or distant shipping disruptions, it also limits exposure to currency volatility caused by overdependence on foreign markets. Shorter supply chains mean faster recovery during crises. Stronger regional markets mean more stable growth, and that builds resilience. In global economics, resilience is not just stability, it's strategic independence. Because the more an economy can sustain itself and trade on its own terms, the less pressure external forces can apply. And resilience over time translates into real autonomy. Let's stay balanced. Africa is not cutting off Western trade, nor is it abandoning long-standing economic relationships. Europe and North America remain major trading partners, major investors, and important security collaborators. Those connections are deeply integrated into global finance and supply chains. But diversification changes the equation. When economies rely heavily on a single dominant route or a single dominant partner, leverage becomes one-sided. When alternatives exist, negotiation becomes more equal. Instead of one dominant corridor shaping exports and imports, multiple trade routes begin to operate in parallel. Instead of one primary geopolitical anchor, multiple alliances create flexibility. This is not isolation, it is optionality. Strategic freedom does not mean choosing one side over another. It means having choices. And in global trade, having choices is power. Thanks for watching.